First speaker will be Bill Richards. Bill was last man standing at the Spring Grove facility in Maryland back in the 60s and early 70s. I think they stopped their research in 76, if I'm not mistaken. And now he's with Johns Hopkins. He's a clinical psychologist and was the primary therapist in the Johns Hopkins psilocybin study generating a mystical experience. So Bill's going to talk about the rebirth of research with entheogens, lessons from the past and hypotheses for the future. Bill Richards is a Ph.D. as a psychologist in the psychiatry department of Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, Bayview Medical Center. He's currently pursuing research with entheogens and has a private practice in Baltimore. His graduate degrees include Master of Divinity from Yale Divinity School, a Master of Sacred Theology from Andover Newton Theological School, and a Ph.D. from Catholic University. Richards also studied with Abraham Maslow at Brandeis University and with Hans Karl Luhner at George August University in Gottenheim, Germany. Luhner was one person who did research with LSD, I believe, over a period of 20 or 30 or maybe even longer years. He was not shut down. And that's where his involvement with psilocybin research originated in 1963. From 67 to 77, Richards pursued psychotherapy research with LSD, DPT, MDA, and psilocybin at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center, Spring Groves, along with colleagues such as Walter Ponke, Charles Savage, Stan Groff, John Reed, and Rich Jensen. His research included protocols designed to investigate the promise of entheogens in the treatment of alcoholism, severe neuroses, narcotic addiction, and the psychological distress associated with terminal cancer. A wonderful book called The Human Encounter with Death, which summarizes some of that research and how they started with the work on terminal cancer. And also their use of the training, in the training of religious and mental health professionals, maybe one of the first applications that will be integrated into our society. He helped design and served as the primary guide in the Hopkins research that demonstrated, the recent Hopkins research, that demonstrated the positive correlation between psilocybin and mystical experiences. So I will turn you over to the very capable hands of Bill Richards. Thank you again for coming.
Good morning. It's good to be here. I promised Neil I'd try to be exactly 30 minutes in duration, so I'm going to do my best. Here goes. In his book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, William James referred to the intuitive knowledge that often is intrinsic to mystical states of consciousness as the noetic quality, emphasizing that, quote, although so similar to states of feeling, mystical states seem to those who experience them to be also states of knowledge. Abe Maslow, not only the pioneering psychologist who drew our attention to the study of mental health, to peak experiences, self-actualization, and the further reaches of human nature, but also a great Jewish mystic who never took psychedelic drugs, similarly wrote, quote, the peak experience is felt as a self-validating, self-justifying moment, which carries its own intrinsic value with it. It is felt to be a highly valuable, even uniquely valuable experience. So great an experience sometimes that even to attempt to justify it takes away from its dignity and worth. It justifies not only itself, but even living itself. Many of you recognize the wisdom inherent in the verse from the Tao Te Ching. Those who know do not speak. Those who speak do not know. 46 years ago, actually in Hans Leuner's clinic in Göttingen, finishing a research project of a personal psilocybin experience, I looked at what I had written and then wrote, what is a transcendent dimension of being? Such words on paper are little more than metaphysical poetry. Somehow I feel I could better communicate my experience by composing a symphony or by molding a piece of contemporary sculpture, had I the talents for either form of artistic expression. Only my silence can retain its purity and genuineness. Yet, here I am. addressing you, obviously about to try to use words to describe mystical states. I own some inner conflict about this and trust that you who listen will allow me some poetic license. However, if mysticism is to emerge from silent monastic cells into the bright light of scientific discourse, I see no alternative. Scholars in the psychology of religious experience and neuroscientists alike, who today explore the nature and relevance of mystical states, need language to define as clearly as possible what is meant by mystical consciousness and how to determine when it has occurred and when it has not occurred. This is especially important in investigations of the contributions that psychedelic drugs may make to psychotherapeutic treatment, for it has become increasingly clear that it is not the administration of a drug or a drug effect that positively correlates with significant attitudinal and behavioral changes, but rather the occurrence of discrete states of consciousness, most notably mystical consciousness, during the period of drug action. Mystical states of consciousness we define in accordance with the perennial philosophy, or the so-called universal core. And these states, when expressed in written descriptions, generally provide evidence of 6 experiential categories. 1, unity, approached either internally with closed eyes or externally through sense perception. 2, transcendence of time and space. 3, intuitive knowledge. 4, sacredness or awesomeness. 5, deeply felt positive mood, love, purity, peace, joy. And 6, ineffability and paradoxicality. Paradoxicality refers to the collapse of Aristotelian logic, and not only vocabulary, but the categorical structures of cognition in the attempt to express mystical consciousness in language. Not unlike physicists who describe energy as both wave and particle. Reports include claims of having died, but never feeling more alive, of ultimate reality that is non-personal yet personal, eternal yet including time, one yet many, profoundly serious yet playful, even as the void or nothingness that contains all reality. For research purposes, we consider a complete mystical experience as a state of human awareness that includes all 6 categories. One also could formulate a category of incomplete mystical consciousness that may not include the complete transcendence of the ego or noteworthy noetic content. Also, we can make a distinction between mystical and archetypal states. Archetypal experiences require an observing, participating ego, and often occurred just before or just after the unity of complete mystical consciousness. Archetypal experiences tend to be impressive in their own right, entailing visions of gods and goddesses, the Christ, the Buddha, the dancing Shiva, intricately beautiful inner architecture, precious gemstones and metals, visionary landscapes from different historical periods, and the phenomenon of inner light itself. This is the realm described by Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell, where myth arises, not as something that isn't true, but as a symbolic saga that portrays our spiritual journeys. Let us also acknowledge purely psychodynamic experiences without accompanying mystical or archetypal content that typically entail regression to childhood traumas, emotional catharsis, and powerful feelings of resolution and rebirth. Clearly, these 3 domains of human consciousness, the mystical, the archetypal, and the personal psychodynamic, have profound promise in psychological treatment and in spiritual development. They stand in sharp contrast to mildly altered states of sensory change, and intriguing but generally meaningless imagery triggered by psychedelics in low dosage, or in contexts lacking adequate safety to allow for focused intent and unconditional trust. Also, they stand in sharp contrast to states of confusion, panic, and paranoia that often occur when psychedelics are administered without adequate preparation or skilled guidance. In considering why the experience of mystical consciousness may be especially facilitative of psychological and spiritual growth, let us consider 5 of the most common noetic insights reported. First, there is an intuitive recognition and confirmation that the spiritual dimension of life is valid, that in every day we really are spiritual beings having human experiences, as I think Teilhard de Chardin first proposed. The individual person may label this reality any way he or she desires, as God, the ground of being, the Christ consciousness, the source, the force, the void, the Tao, Buddha fields, the dance of Shiva, the higher power, or even as nothingness. But there typically is an unshakable conviction that consciousness includes infinitely more than our individual egos, that is, the everyday personalities identified with our proper names. Second, this transpersonal reality reliably is experienced as being eternal and indestructible, perhaps including time, but beyond time and history. Persons trained in philosophy or quantum physics may have the verbal skills to articulate an experiential recognition that time, space, and substance really are relative, not absolute. To Christians, the familiar Gloria Patri suddenly makes sense, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Third, mystical consciousness often includes a conviction that within this unitive world, all of us are interconnected and interrelated, that we are brothers and sisters in the world, irrespective of cultural and racial heritages or the condition in which we discover ourselves. In Hinduism, this is called the bejeweled net of Indra. In Christianity, the brotherhood of man. Fourth, persons who have experienced mystical consciousness often express an insight that at the ultimate origin of the energy we call consciousness is love. Such love is more than emotion. It also is claimed to radiate power and compassion and to have ultimate ontological status. Perhaps Dante was right when he wrote, "It is love that moves the sun and other stars." And fifth, let us note the reports of incredible beauty that appears intrinsic to mystical states. Persons often speak of utter awe at the magnificence they have experienced, how much they saw with their eyes closed. In the visionary world, there are art objects that the great museums would treasure if they were manifested in matter. There is a sense of amazement that such images can appear in the fields of consciousness of otherwise rather ordinary people. How to understand such reports is one of the current frontiers of human thought. Are persons rediscovering the Platonic realm of forms? Might we all have access to a universal cache of museum-quality images, either genetically encoded or spiritually accessed? However we may understand the origin of such beauty, the memory of it leaves a person with an enhanced reverence for his or her own mind. One who has experienced the death and rebirth of his or her usual personality and discovers the impressive memory of unitive consciousness afterwards typically is awestruck. Such consciousness frequently is described as feeling more real than everyday awareness. The archetypal images that surround it often are surprising, not frequently out of sync with one's expectations or enculturation. From this experiential subjective perspective, the reductionistic assumption that posits that somehow we are our brains, and that when we die and our brains decompose, consciousness vanishes, appears highly questionable, perhaps significantly underestimating the mysteries of life. The Dalai Lama's reminders that, quote, the view that all mental processes are necessarily physical processes is a metaphysical assumption, not a scientific fact, and that current neuroscience does not have any real explanation of consciousness itself. These words may strike one as very reasonable. But like a medieval saint listening to a little demon on his shoulder, many of us also hear voices of doubt. Maybe mystical consciousness is one gigantic delusion created by a bedrugged, malfunctioning, or dying brain, desperately denying its own finitude and transience. Is this a manifestation of pathology, cognitive impairment, schizoid withdrawal from reality, or mere regression to an infantile oceanic state of mind? Especially since we have a growing cache of data that identifies correlations between blood flow in the brain and different states of awareness, including mystical-like states, shouldn't we assume that correlation actually is causation, and we need look no further? We have arrived at that frontier where the growing edge of true science meets the mystery of the unknown, at least unknown insofar as it can be expressed through our present cognitive and verbal capacities. Here, each person is on his or her own, choosing the philosophical, religious, or spiritual framework in and through which he orients himself and expresses his being in the world. Here, faith takes over, either as faith in something or belief in nothing. And once again, we are aware that it is really not in the purview of science to prove or to disprove the reality of God. In harmony with William James, what we can expect from science in good pragmatic style is to help us discern the practical consequences of mystical consciousness here in the everyday world. Does it contribute to making people more compassionate and courageous? Or does it contribute to making people more flaky and irresponsible? Does it tend to make people more altruistic, or more self-absorbed, more wise, or more deluded? Obviously, the answers to such questions must include consideration of variables in addition to the occurrence of mystical consciousness itself, most notably the development of the person before it occurred, the disciplines exercised to integrate its insights afterwards, perhaps the collection of words and concepts available to articulate to oneself what has happened, and also the interpersonal and community support available to facilitate integration. Many hypotheses can be generated and tested through carefully designed research projects, utilizing many different entheogens, known and yet to be synthesized, in different doses, in different supportive settings, with many different subject populations, examining phenomenological content of experiences, measurable changes in attitudes and behavior, and biochemical and neurological correlates. Now I invite you briefly to consider the impact that the memory of mystical consciousness may have on a terminal cancer patient and on a narcotic addict or alcoholic. Had we more time, I would reflect on the impact on persons suffering from anxiety or depression and on sociopathic personalities. These thoughts, admittedly, are speculative, awaiting well-designed, controlled research studies, Yet they are supported by interviews with many persons and remarkable consensus among those who have experienced mystical states. Although many persons with terminal cancer who report mystical consciousness also claim, although many persons without terminal cancer who report mystical consciousness also claim loss of a fear of death. This alleged insight can be especially comforting to those who know that their physical bodies soon will cease to function. Typically, fear becomes replaced with curiosity and trust in deeper strata of consciousness. Eternity, a state of awareness outside of time, often described as pulsating with love and life, no longer is an abstract concept, but rather is a memory of an experience, perhaps more vivid than the memory of visiting a foreign city on vacation. One knows he or she really has been there. With this loss of the fear of death in earlier studies with cancer patients at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center, we often found decreased anxiety, depression, interpersonal isolation, and preoccupation with pain. Death is not denied, but rather life is seen in a broader perspective that transcends the journey between birth and death. Regardless of one's philosophical assumptions or theory of the relation of the brain to human consciousness, it is striking that cancer patients who experience mystical consciousness usually tend to behave in mature, centered ways afterwards, to live the time that remains as fully and genuinely as possible, and not uncommonly to communicate with family members in ways that are reconciling, an aspect of this research that has profound relevance for preventive medicine. Many would see such behavior as evidence not of impairment or pathology, but of health, maturity, and spiritual development. In our current research with psilocybin and cancer patients at Johns Hopkins, as in similar studies by Charles Grobe and Alicia Danforth at UCLA, and by Steve Ross and Tony and his colleagues here at NYU, we hope to replicate and further extend these findings. Please visit our website at cancer-insight.org, cancer-insight.org. Pioneering investigations into the promise of psychotherapy assisted by psychedelic drugs in the treatment of alcoholism and narcotic addiction in the 1960s yielded controversial results. Clearly, it was demonstrated that we are not dealing with a simple psychopharmacological effect. One does not administer LSD to treat alcoholism the way one administers aspirin to relieve a headache. Set and setting are of paramount importance here, including the competent training of the therapists or guides who implement treatment. As with cancer patients, so it is that the persons suffering from addictions who experience mystical consciousness often appear to derive the greatest benefit. Even when mystical consciousness is complete, however, this intervention is not magic. Addicts still need continuing group support and often assistance with housing and employment. Nevertheless, when an addict finds within himself the memory of mystical consciousness, his view of himself, others, and the world is likely to be forever altered. Having experienced incredible beauty and love within himself, it is much more difficult to view himself as worthless. He knows that there is no source of guilt or remorse that cannot be forgiven. The noetic awareness of his interconnectedness with the family of man can replace feelings of alienation and estrangement. And of course, there is no doubt that the higher power stressed in AA and NA now clearly is recognized as a very real and vibrant reality. Perhaps these were among the reasons that Bill Wilson, the founder of AA, was supportive of the use of LSD in the treatment of alcoholism after his own personal LSD experiences. When we asked heroin addicts treated with psychedelic psychotherapy to compare heroin and LSD, invariably the two drugs were described as being diametrically opposed to one another. Whereas heroin drew one away from one's interpersonal world into an anxiety-free warm bath, LSD tended to draw one in and through interpersonal conflicts en route to truly transcendental states of awareness. Looking into the future, there are potential applications of psychedelics to consider beyond the scope of medical treatment. First is the use of psychedelics in the training of religious and mental health providers. How many clergy and professors of religion have never experienced revelatory forms of consciousness? Personal knowledge of some of the varieties of religious experience could be of significant value to such persons, providing experiential grounding in the truths they proclaim, and also tolerance and respect for religious systems and traditions different from one's own. Similarly, there is experiential knowledge of the terrain and principles of operation of the human psyche that could be of great value for mental health professionals. Second is the use of psychedelics in education and creativity in general, both in the humanities and the sciences. Consider the potential value of archetypal and mystical experiences for a scholar of philosophy or literature. Plato's allegory of the cave becomes simple to understand, and Dante's Divine Comedy may come alive in new ways. In the sciences, there are frontiers in biology and physics that might well be explored experientially as persons with the requisite cognitive and verbal skills reflect upon the mystery of consciousness and the nature of matter. Geneticists Francis Crick and Carrie Mullis allegedly found their creativity enhanced during the action of LSD. It is no secret that the art of Alex and Allison Gray has been inspired by the recall of visionary experiences. Jeremy Narby has made the intriguing proposal that some of the so-called divine architecture of Gothic arches and Islamic domes reported during the action of psilocybin actually may be subjective perceptions of cellular structures or photons being emitted by DNA. Rick Strassman invites us to take a second look at the pineal gland, which Descartes long ago viewed as the seat of the soul. Third, of course, is the purely religious use of entheogens, as is already accepted in communities that have used peyote, mushrooms, or ayahuasca for hundreds, if not thousands of years, continuing today. When leaders of major institutional world religions manifest sufficient vision and courage to address ways in which selected psychedelics might responsibly be integrated into worship or retreat experiences, there is much to be learned, not only from recent scientific research, but also from indigenous people who appear to have long employed these substances wisely and safely and without evidence of abuse. Now, let us return to Earth and soberly consider the patient's systematic research that needs to be done if cultural attitudes are to shift and at least some psychedelic substances are to be reclassified and made more available with appropriate safeguards. Many of you are familiar with our initial study, Johns Hopkins, that demonstrated in a carefully designed controlled study that psilocybin indeed is capable of occasioning experience of mystical consciousness in many normal volunteer subjects, and the 14-month follow-up study of those subjects that indicated sustained positive effects. We have since published an extensive paper that discusses how to minimize the probability of safety and benefit in the design of new research projects, and soon we'll publish a dose-response study. These papers are all easily found on the web. notably at csp.org. Thanks to Bob Jesse. I close with 3 suggestions regarding the design of future research, perhaps studies some of you present here today may implement. First, let's be very cautious about generalizing about initial experiences with a substance and talking about that substance's effects. There is a very broad range of experiences that can occur during the action of many psychedelics, and only carefully designed comparative studies with adequate samples can tease out whether or not any particular substance may have a higher probability of providing access to a particular state of consciousness. Reflecting on the many reports I have reviewed of experiences facilitated by LSD, DPT, and psilocybin, I am not aware of any quality that is unique to any of the 3 beyond speed of onset and duration of action. Simply stated, the experiences are not in any drug, they are in us. Second, let us never repeat the mistakes of the past by administering psychedelics without responsible attention to the potent variables of careful screening and selection and of set and setting. Safety with these substances requires respectful interpersonal grounding and the intent to choose to relinquish the controls of the ego, to trust unconditionally in a safe research environment. We know too much about the unique properties of these substances, including their potential to facilitate destabilizing and frightening experiences, to administer just another drug to unprepared or inadequately prepared volunteers in the name of so-called objective science. To do so would be unethical. Also, careful screening is important, as there are persons with genetic tendencies towards severe mental illness, and persons with cardiac arrhythmias and other physical conditions for whom the risk of adverse responses to psychedelic substances is high. Third, in our fascination with alternate states of consciousness, let us not forget the importance of the everyday interpersonal world. As Houston Smith has reminded us, what really matters is not religious experiences, but religious lives, not states, but traits. In Buddhism, the enlightened man chops wood and carries water, and returns in harmony with the bodhisattva ideal to serve. In Judaism and Christianity, there is the model of the suffering servant. Applied to research protocols and the medical application of psychedelics, it is clear that the interpersonal grounding provided in preparation for psychedelic sessions and in the integration of the insights that occur is crucial. Compulsive re-administering of psychedelic drugs without taking time for integration is unlikely to yield positive results. In closing, let us acknowledge that research with these substances has led the growing edge of science to the gates of spiritual reality, to realms where time is experienced differently or wholly transcended, and where the deepest secrets of the nature of mind and matter may be revealed. This is truly awesome. It invites humility, not as a devaluing of ourselves, but as awe before the incredible vastness of being. I thank you. Questions, comments, insights? Yes, sir.
How long do you think it will take to get to the point in society
I wish I knew, but there was a time, you know, when someone said the Berlin Wall will never come down and the Soviet Union will never cease to exist. And Obama will never get elected. Okay, so who knows? But social change does happen.
Yeah, I have a question. I am bipolar. It's considered a disorder by a lot of people. I've taken medications. I've had a lot of manic episodes, and I've also found that with mushrooms, I get mystical experiences that are rather profound, and I would love to be in certain studies, but it always seems that for psychiatric people, it's only mono-depression, unipolar depression that's ever studied, and never bipolar. And I think that bipolar people have a rare gift as opposed to a serious illness. I'd like your comments on that.
Yeah, actually you are the second person who has commented on the value that you as an individual person has found with psilocybin with a diagnosis of bipolar illness. And who knows, research projects are needed. Our guidelines right now at Hopkins would be to screen out anyone with a history of or even a family history of a significant bipolar illness or schizophrenia. And that's just, I guess, instincts not to take unnecessary risks in launching new research projects. But that would be a research project all its own that could be done someday. We don't have the answer yet. Sorry. Yeah.
I was wondering if you notice any differences in results that are reported by people from different environmental backgrounds, whether people from an industrial society with a high degree of education had significantly different experiences than those from less developed cultures.
Good question. My general gut impression from just doing this for a long time is that the main difference is not in the content of the experience, but in the verbal vocabulary, the skills you have to talk about it afterwards. For example, I remember a very culturally deprived narcotic addict who talked about seeing funny figures with strange hats on their heads dancing, you know, and then he came across a book on Vedic art and came running into my office saying, "This is what I saw, this is what I saw," you know. But he had never studied comparative religions. He didn't know the word dancing Shiva, but something still happened in his experience. And how to understand that how it's very common, as many of you appreciate, for people to experience phenomenological content that is not part of their life history. You know, it's not what you were taught in Sunday school, you know? And where that comes from is incredible. You know, is it encoded in our genes? Is whatever it means to spiritually access things. And similarly, people who want a specific experience, like I've worked with a number of Catholic priests who desperately want to experience the so-called beatific vision. And often what they experience is unresolved sexual conflicts of childhood. Okay? You know? But in the wisdom of the psyche, that's what needs to be dealt with first, okay? But the idea that people who don't understand this field think that, well, you just experience what you expect, and it's all suggestion, just doesn't hold up, you know? Now and then you get what you hope for, but it's not at all dependable. Yeah.
Hey, Bill.
Rick.
Yeah, I mean, you have so much experience with this, like, you know, 4 or 5 decades. So I'm wondering if you could kind of crystallize, what is your therapeutic method? What does it mean to be a sitter for somebody? How do you try to interact with them in a helpful way? What is that characterizes your approach?
It is an art, and it's probably an art more of knowing when not to say something than when to say something. You know, how not to interfere, but still be supportive. It's a very great honor. You know, when mystical experiences occur, I mean, sometimes you feel like you're sitting at the feet of the Buddha under the bo tree, and that person lying on the couch is infinitely wiser than you are in that moment. And it is very awesome and very sacred work to guide people through these experiences. I think psychologically, when I'm training new guides, I often have them read Jim Buchenthal's book, what is it, Psychotherapy in Process. It's a little thin book, but it's on the so-called existential humanistic approach to psychotherapy, but it stresses the power of presence, immediacy, feeling that you're two kind of equals in the world as opposed to playing the doctor-patient game. And it gives a very helpful framework for psychedelic therapy. Yes?
Beyond the research experience, can you comment on the medical application to entheogens and psychedelics? Where do you see it, or because I don't know much about what you've done, but its application, has it been taken into the medical aspect?
Well, right now, you know, one of the applications is on treating the psychological depressive of cancer patients, anxiety, depression, fear of death, isolation, helping people live more fully. I think there's a huge frontier to reactivate in the treatment of addictions, if that's what you're asking. Yeah. You know, we need lots of funding and lots of vision and lots of people doing really careful, well-designed work. And why not? Let's do it. Another area that's really untouched almost is the work with sociopathic personalities. You know, clearly we're in a culture where we have a huge prison industry and courts, and there's all kinds of people that we just warehouse because they have perhaps trouble feeling guilt or connection with the family of man in some way. My own personal view is any nation that can put men on the moon can also learn how to treat a sociopathic personality. And I think psychedelic therapy is one very promising area to explore. It's not cheap. It'll probably entail, you know, residential treatment in a number of sessions. But compared to warehousing someone for a lifetime, I think it's worth exploring. Yeah?
How, if at all, do you see psychedelics being able to reach the masses in a way that they can get a positive experience out of it without creating kind of the hysteria that happened in the 60s?
Yeah. We are in a very different period of history. It really, just the way people have responded to our Hopkins research as opposed to the research 30 years ago is radically different, you know. And there is a major educational job to do in the culture. You know, that many people, when they hear psychedelic drugs, they just think disturbed teenager with tie-dye t-shirt in emergency room, you know. And because they're the ones who have been taking psychedelics, and the mature, healthy, mainstream, thank you, the mature, healthy, mainstream professionals haven't had legal access. And so the attitudes of the culture have really become skewed. And, you know, people today, when you say psychedelic drugs, they don't think Houston Smith, Aldous Huxley, Alan Watts. You know, they think the disturbed kid down the street, you know, and we got to change that by doing good research and by having a responsible, non-sensationalistic articles and publications as well. Yes, sir. Do we have time for one more here? Okay.
Hi. Is this on? Yeah. Do you regard the mystical experience potentially achieved through psychedelic states as the same variety of religious experience that you might achieve through meditation, trance, shamanic vision? I was interested because you mentioned the notion of a professor of religion sort of having that experience through psychedelics, and I wonder, is that simply, in your view, a faster way of achieving the same variety?
That's a wonderful question. Thanks for asking it. The question is whether the psychedelic experience of mystical consciousness is the same as the meditative or spontaneous mystical experience. The best way I can answer this is I think it can be for many people. I think both in meditation and in psychedelics, sometimes experiences of sensory change are misinterpreted as mystical experiences. But ultimately, I think it boils down to a personal judgment. It's like, do you love your wife, you know? Was your experience genuine? That's a judgment you make within yourself, and you choose whether or not to trust it. But my hunch is it's the same biochemistry happening in the brain and the same phenomenological world, basically.
I had a question about, as you were speaking about like narcotics, and so do you find any benefit with narcotics or less psychoactive substances like, say, cocaine, narcotics? There seems to be a rift between psychedelics and less psychoactive substances. Is there any benefit that you see as a researcher with some of the less psychoactive substances, but yet illegal, that still fall in that category as illegal substances? Sorry, it's a not well thought out question, but question being, the psychedelic community seems to have a stigma around less psychedelic substances like, say, cocaine or narcotics. Have you had any research, or have you done any research with those, and do you find any benefits with the less psychedelic substances?
Yeah, I really can't answer that because I haven't worked with narcotics as such. I've treated narcotic addicts with psychedelic psychotherapy, and I haven't personally done any cocaine research, but the culture tends to lump all these drugs together, and even to call psychedelics narcotics, which is just ignorance. But again, that leads to the educational task we have. I think the inner worlds that open up are very, very different with the three substances mentioned, for most people anyway.
You feel within the psychedelic community there could be an awareness of other substances, let's say cocaine or narcotics, an awareness that you say they all come together, but I think within the psychedelic community there's a separation.
Yeah, I think there is a separation, and it's a very important one.
Well,
yeah. Yeah, in the understanding of all drugs are bad except alcohol that we serve at the White House. Okay. All drugs are bad except alcohol, which is culturally endorsed. Okay. If in the minds of the masses, and we just have to patiently do good work and educate, I think.
For those of you who couldn't hear, the woman saying that it has to do with keeping these substances in their context, in their cultural context, like coca leaf versus refined powder, might be one way to look at it, as how it can be. Excuse me. So just how it could be integrated into the society. And LSD is a chemical. You're right. You're right. So it's an open question. Are there other questions? We really do have. Well, these guys are working on the technology. Bill, can you handle one more question for us?
Sure.
Great.
Thank you. I've heard you say a lot of interesting things about people using psychedelics for treating issues, which is wonderful and amazing. I'm just wondering if there's anyone doing any research using psychedelics for like advanced cognitive functioning. I mean, I know anecdotally a lot of like learning, I feel, is facilitated, especially like with language or like physical skills. And I just think that's a really wide open field, and I'm wondering, I mean, obviously there's a lot to be done. I'm wondering if anyone is doing that or thinking about doing that.
Whether psychedelic can be used in creativity research, or I think that's even learn. It's an untapped area of research. Back in the 60s in Menlo Park, Jim Fadiman and Robert Mogar and a group did some very fascinating research where they took people who were really well established in their fields, architects or physicists or artists, whatever, who were struggling with a particular problem in their creativity, and in the latter hours of an LSD session, they were presented with those problems to work on. And many claim that they saw their issues from new perspectives and that it enhanced cognitive functioning and facilitated creativity. But, all we have is it's same in the treatment of neuroses, if you will. There's all kinds of wonderful case studies, kind of testimonials here and there, but, very little systematic, well-designed research has been done would really be convincing to the scientific community. And that's the threshold we're at right now. We need to do the very best science we can, I think.
Okay, let's thank Bill and give these guys 2 more minutes.